my interest in the topic of autobiographical and collective memory comes from really an interest in the way in which monuments play an important role in cultural lives, and how they often become an extreme point of contention among different groups in society. And so I was interested how really politically contested memory is, and how ill-equipped our many of our philosophical conceptions of memory are to explain this deeply contested nature of memory. So that was what originally prompted me to investigate this topic. So what I'm listing here is that what I'm hoping to do in this talk. I do not know how much of a conceptual engineering talk it really is, but you are the experts on this, so you will tell me. So the talk really has, I think, three aims. The slogan, if you want, for the talk is that autobiographical memory is for action. So in a way, I'm going to defend the view that the function of autobiographical and collective memories is not past-oriented, but is future-oriented. So that's the slogan. So what I want to do, and in this regard, it might be conceptual engineering, is to say that our folk psychological conceptions or concepts of autobiographical memory are totally misguided and very ill-equipped for the purpose of explaining why memory is such a fraught topic. What I'm going to say is that our folk psychological conception of autobiographical memory is that autobiographical memories give us propositional knowledge of past events, and that this knowledge, if you want, is sustained or enabled by the retention of information stored in the brain about such events. I think that, if you want, the archival conception of autobiographical memory is completely mistaken. It would be interesting, I think, to try to figure out why our folk psychological conception of what autobiographical memory is and is about, it's so off the reality. But so the first aim, as I said, is to try to sort of say that our archival conception or concept of autobiographical knowledge is mistaken in many, many dimensions, and to provide, if you want, a different concept stroke conception of autobiographical knowledge as something that is future directed. This conception of autobiographical and collective memory that is future directive is, I think, an empirically informed account, and its main planks are as follows, which I'm going to try to argue for today. One is that these memories are the product of a kind of imagination, so they are the output of the exercise of the imagination, that they are narratively structured, and that they are representations that comprise all sorts of heterogeneous representations in a narrative structure. So they'll include information stored in the brain, but information acquired by testimony, and also information contained in material artifacts. So if you want, autobiographical memories are distributed, they are not located in human brains. Autobiographical memories are a source of, when successful, are a source of understanding rather than knowledge of a mere bunch of proposition. So if understanding is knowledge, then they are a source of knowledge, but of that special kind of knowledge that is understanding. And they are in the service of practical agency. And that's why I believe that memory is for future action. And finally, I use this account of autobiographical and collective memory to make sense of why memories are so deeply politically contested. So those are the three aims: to show that the archival conception of autobiographical memory is mistaken, to provide an alternative conception of autobiographical memories that sees them as narratives, that sees them as distributed, and that sees them as the output of imagination. And three, to use this conception to explain why memories are a source of political contestations. Very briefly, what the plan of the talk. So I will begin by explaining what episodic memory is and why really is a form of imagination known as mental time travel. I will then briefly suggest that the function of mental time travel are practical and social. I will then briefly explain how mental time travel is deeply permeated by social influences, so social contagion and exposure and retrieval effects, which I will explain. And then out of all of this, I will develop a new conception of autobiographical memory as a narrative representation, which, when successful, enables a special understanding of past activities, one that is serviceable for future planning. Once I've developed all of this, I will then show why autobiographical memories are ripe for a certain kind of mnemonic or memory like injustice. And then I will hopefully move to collective memories and show how similar considerations apply in that case. As a result, I'm arguing that people can have collective memories of events that precede the existence of any of the people who are current members of the group, so that you can remember in a collective autobiographical way things that happened before you were born. And I'm going to try to argue why that notion makes sense, but to be able to distinguish this notion of collective memory from just the idea of history or historical knowledge or historical understanding. So that is the plan. And so let me now try to execute it. So first of all, there are many different kinds of memory. There is short-term or working memory, and there is long-term memory. I'm only interested in long-term memory. And even long-term memory really is a bunch of disparate things. Many taxonomies distinguish between declarative and non-declarative memory. And within declarative memory, they distinguish between semantic memory, that is memory of facts. So, for instance, when I remember that Tony Blair became Prime Minister of the UK in 1997, I am remembering the fact, and that kind of long-term memory is known as semantic memory. But there is also a different kind of declarative memory, which is known as episodic memory. Arguably, although this is a matter of empirical controversy, arguably human beings are, as far as we know, are the only animals on this planet that have episodic memory. Episodic memory is the reliving of past experiences typically from a first personal point of view, and with experiences them with a sense of pastness. And so episodic memory is a form of conscious reliving or re-experiencing of past events as past, and from the sense that one has experienced them before. So it's a kind of, I don't want to stack the deck in my favor, but it's a kind of reliving the past, re-immersing oneself in one's own past and seeing it from one's own perspective. Autobiographical memory then is typically thought to be basically episodic memory, but supplemented with some semantic memories. And so autobiographic memory is our memory of our own past, of one's past experiences, that is largely or partially at least typically episodic, i.e. a kind of reliving past events, but also supplemented by knowledge of past facts that concern one's own life. I should say this is in typical human beings. There are individuals who suffer from certain forms of amnesia that have lost completely the ability to have episodic memories and are able to keep track of their life by having autobiographical memory that is entirely based on semantic memory, scaffolded by all sorts of material. So if you have seen that film Memento, where the person had suffered from anterogradal amnesia and managed to keep track of their own lives by writing notes to themselves, by tattooing themselves, there are people who are genuinely to some extent in this predicament, and they tend to use various softwares with notes to keep track of their daily existence, given that they are not able to commit anything to long-term memory when it comes to their episodic memory. So declarative memory in general is distinct from procedural memory, which is also of various kinds. But for me, in my experience, the clearest case of episodic memory is when you go to the ATM to draw cash. I remember the numbers, but I often don't rely on my memory of the numbers. What I rely on is my memory of just the pattern of pressing buttons that I do, and it's remembered as a procedure. Press that button in that spatial pattern. That would be an example of procedural memory. What I'm interested in this talk is exclusively autobiographical memory, and in particular its episodic component, and I'm interested in autobiographical memory, both in the individual case, which is autobiographical memory proper, but also in the collective case. And I think that collective memories can be thought as autobiographical memories of groups. Right, so let me start undermining the concept of autobiographical memory as kind of the retrieval of information that was first stored in the brain when one first experienced a certain event. This undermining is based on the advances of empirical research of memory that show that in the case of episodic memory, and it is episodic memory that I'm mostly focusing on, the cognitive processes that are deployed are actually the same, largely the same. They are involved in imagining the future or in considering counterfactually future possibilities. And so there is there is largely consensus in psychology on the view that the cognitive processes underpinning episodic memory is something known as mental time travel, which is the imaginative projection of oneself into the personal past. If that's right, then episodic memory really is the product of a process of simulation that is a kind of information. And so reliving episodes from one's own past is the output of the same sort of processes that are involved when imagining a future event and when imagining what would happen in various counterfactual situations. All of these, imagining the future, imagining possible counterfactual situation, reliving the past, they all involve manipulating information, some of which is retained from past experience, some of which is acquired by means of testimony, some of which is included in various symbolic representations, such as books and so forth, and are manipulated roughly in the same way. So if that's right, then episodic memory as the product of mental time travel is the reliving of past experiences, which is essentially an act of the imagination. And so what we do when we reminisce or engage in the retrieval of episodic memory, what we are actually doing is we are simulating being back in the past, and we engage in this process of mental simulation using materials, right, which are based on past experiences, but also other material. And we combine it into a story or narrative. And this idea that we combine it into a story or narrative will become very important as we proceed, and I will explain why. Combine it into a narrative via processes that are constructive and that include selection. So only certain aspects of the past episode make it into the narrative. Condensation, i.e. the narrative actually is a generalized narrative that includes experiences that derive from several different past episodes, and then a narrative framing or a narrative template, which we often borrow from templates that are culturally available. And I'll say a little bit more about all of these in a second. So this picture comes from a paper by Michaelian, and it's meant to give you a sense of the complexity of the constructive processes underpinning episodic memory. It's certainly not true that we experience something, we encode that information, we just store it, and then we retrieve it when we remember. There is encoding, there is storage, but at every phase of that process, there is selection. So certain bits of information are lost and others are retained. And the principles of selection often are based on current interests. So interests at the time when one had the experience might mean that certain aspects of it never get encoded. And then various sort of cultural schemas and various sort of concerns and interests then partially determine what information is retained in storage, how it is modified, how it is condensed. So for instance, I have memories of summers at the seaside. My memory of summer at the seaside is never a specific event, never a specific summer, but is a condensation of many years and many summers of at the seaside. So you have this process so that instead of a memory of a specific day at the seaside, your memory becomes a memory of a kind of event, summers at the seaside. And what is retained and how it's retained often depends on how often it's cued. So if people tend to often reminisce certain events, they'll be able to remember them in more detail and for longer. If they are very unfrequently cued, then they will lose much more in terms of detail. And of course, what is retained and what is lost will depend very much on the interests at the time when one multiply retrieved them. So in short, the process of simulating reliving the past is constructive. The information that it includes is condensed or generalized from different past events, as I said, summers at the beach, drawn also from others' testimony about the event. So I have a memory of what it was like when I was not quite well as a kid. And as part of that memory is the memory of what the doctor said to my parents when we had the consultation. And I'm pretty sure that I was there in the consultation. I clearly remember it, but remembering what the doctors say is clearly part of testimony from my parents, because I would have been too young to understand and therefore encode all of that. But it's now part of my episodic memory of this. So our episodic memories also include material that actually was originally gained via testimony. And of course, they include materials that is drawn from pictures and diaries and news items. Is selected on the basis of current background knowledge, mood, desires, and interests. And of course, it was selected at encoding based on mood, background knowledge, and interests at the time. And importantly, is then plotted, i.e. turned into a story or a plot using socially available narrative templates. So my narrative template for summers at the beach is happy childhood. And we have, at least in Western society, we have so pre-made narrative templates of a happy childhood, which often includes summers at the beach. And so in all of these ways, our memories are constructed. Right. And so what you end up is with the episodic memory, which is the reliving of a past event, using information from different experiences that are condensed into one, using information that was not present in the original experience, but was imported via the testimony, perhaps of others who were present at the time. That it includes selection based on current interests and affects, and is turned into a narrative or a story based on socially or culturally available templates. Right, if that's how episodic memory works, if it really is the production in the imagination of the experience of reviving a past episode as one that involves you, so that is yours, your experience, and as past, right? If that's what episodic memory as mental time travel is, right, then it seems odd, right, if its function was to provide a representation or knowledge of the past. Let me just give you a contrast. So we have all sorts of archives that are genuinely archives, and which we have created for the purpose of keeping accurate and complete, to some extent, knowledge of past events. The thing that should strike us is how these artifacts that we have created for the purpose of preserving knowledge of the past, how different they are from from the cognitive mechanisms that humans deploy when reminiscing, when using their episodic memory, right? So it is, given that it's constructive, and as we shall see in a second, is very receptive to social influences, it's extremely unlikely that mental time travel had evolved to serve the function of accurate representation of the past. And in fact, although on this there is no agreement, but the majority of psychologists who are concerned with episodic memory, partially because I think they are impressed by how easy it is to implant false memories onto people, most of them have developed views according to which mental time travel has evolved primarily for future-oriented purposes. And although there is no consensus of this, I am going to sort of say that there is, if we think about how it works, it does make a lot of sense if we think that it has evolved to serve planning and future deliberation. And there is empirical support for this view, but it is not a matter of scientific consensus that this is correct. Another thing that mental time travel does is enhances social functioning. So if you, an interesting feature of human episodic memory is that it's something that we often do together with others. So when you get together with people you haven't seen in a while, interestingly, often, apart from catching up, people tend to reminisce on the shared past. And when they do so, they engage in mental time travel. And doing this enhances social functioning because it makes people feel closer to each other, right? And so this social function of mental time traveling then coheres, in my view, with the view that it has evolved to serve planning and deliberation. Because if you think that human beings are, and on this I think there is consensus, ultra-social animals who often engage in joint activities that are complex and require planning together, then it would make sense that our cognitive mechanism or cognitive systems that have evolved for the purpose of planning and deliberation should be such that are deeply influenced by relations with other people. So they are deeply permeable to social influences, so that they tend to be shaped by mechanisms that lead to mnemonic convergence, i.e. to the construction of a shared simulation of the past. And this makes sense because Doing this then would facilitate the planning and deliberating together in the service of carrying out joint activities. And so what all of this suggests is that these two views of what the function of mental time travel are, namely for future planning and to enhance social functioning, actually seem to coalesce very nicely if we think of human beings as beings that often carry out joint activities that required joint planning. And as we shall see, if we have joint constructions of a shared past, such a joint constructions will enable or facilitate joint planning and deliberation. So I've now suggested one thing, namely that autobiographical memory really is reliving the past in the imagination. And the second is that it's really is constructive and very, very permeable by social influences. I would like now to say a couple of things about what sort of social influences affect memory. So the first one is social contagion, and there is a lot of evidence. Elizabeth Loftus is perhaps most famous for this work, that it is remarkably easy, at least in laboratory conditions, to implant memories so that people are then recollecting events, recollecting certain things happening that did not happen, but that were narrated to them by other people. And this is particularly prominent when people sort of are witness to the same event. They then recollect together about that event. And when speakers arrogate for themselves the role of narrator, so they tell everybody else, right, this is how they remember it, or when the speaker is perceived as an expert, and the speaker, if he is a confederate, voluntarily, knowingly, adds information that is incorrect, others will tend to then incorporate this incorrect information into their recollections of the event. It is remarkable how easy this can be. And again, right, this sort of seems to speak against the view that human episodic memory has evolved for the accurate retention of the past, because even if evolution is not optimizing, nevertheless, memory, if its function were to provide accurate representations of the past, would really be malfunctioning most of the time because of how prone it is to social contagion. Other effects or social influences on memory constructions are known as exposure and retrieval effect. So we use evocative objects a lot. Evocative objects are things like mementos and photographs, and they contain information about past events, but also cue past events, right? And we tend to remember better things that we have retrieved often. And so the presence of evocative objects allows us to retain memories for longer. It also allows us to shape our memories in certain ways. So the things that we'll tend to remember are the things that are cued by the evocative object, right? And so evocative objects shape what information is remembered and what is forgotten. They can also supply a template for how the narrative of the memory is shaped. Another social influence on memory is the so-called saying is believing effect. So we often, when we narrate a past episode to an audience, we tend to calibrate how we say things so that the audience is likely to be receptive. So you might tone down certain aspects because you don't want to offend your audience, or you don't want to lose your audience. Because then those aspects are retrieved in that way, we then tend to remember in the future those events as we narrated them. And so by saying things were in a certain way, we then tend to remember them that way, even if initially the saying it was a kind of toning down or changing it a little bit in order to tune in with one's audience. And finally, and I think this is quite important, especially for collective memory, so I'd like to spend a little time about it. And finally, our memories are influenced by a phenomenon called retrieval-induced forgetting. And I'll give you an example with semantic memory, but this is also applicable to episodic memory. So suppose, and I'll give you an example from a laboratory experiment, and then I'll tell you how it generalizes. So suppose you're told that you have to engage in a memory test, and the memory test consists in remembering pairs where the first item on the pair is a general kind, and the second item in the pair is a species of that kind. So in this example, we have metals and we have trees. And so you have, say, metal, iron, metal, silver, metal, gold, so on and so forth. And then you have tree, birch, tree, elm, tree, oak, and so forth. And you're given all of these pairs. And you read them all. And then you're allowed to practice some. So the scientist makes you practice, so say they make you practice metal, iron, but you only practice some of the pairs within one of the two kinds. So say you only practice metal, and you only practice some metal, specific metal pairs, and you do not practice trees at all. Surprisingly, unsurprisingly, what you remember best is what you practice. So if you practice metal and iron, you tend to remember that. But what you remember second best are the pairings with the kind that you didn't practice at all. So in this case, the tree, birch, tree, elm, tree, oak. What you remember worst of all are the unpracticed pairs that belong to the same kind as the pairs you practice. And so if you didn't practice metal, silver, that's what you remember least well. This phenomenon, it's called retrieval-induced forgetting. There is no consensus of exactly on the mechanism, but it should be something like this, that the retrieval of, in the practice of the iron metal pairs inhibits retrieving semantically related but unpracticed information. So because tree is semantically unrelated to metal, the fact that you didn't practice them means that you've lost a little bit the ability to remember because you haven't practiced it, but otherwise the practice has left them unaffected. But the fact that you practice memory with your practice retrieving metals means that the metals you haven't practiced have actually been inhibited. The memory of them has been inhibited. So retrieving information of a certain kind inhibits the retrieval of semantically related information. This is about semantic memory, but the same thing happens with episodic memory. What that means is that if you retrieve some information about a past experience, the unretrieved information about that same past experience will become that little bit harder to remember. And this retrieval induced forgetting, i.e. retrieving information about some element of a past event, induces forgetting of other elements that have left unretrievally, can be done in a way that is socially shared. What that means is that if I tell a story about the past, a past that you have also witnessed, and as I narrate my story of that past episode, which you have also witnessed, I select to tell some parts of the story, but not others. The parts of the story that I do not tell will be parts of the story that will be harder for me to remember in future. But interestingly, there will also be the part of the story that become harder for you to remember in future. And this only happens if you and I, if you're not hostile to me. But if you're not hostile to me, you're probably, although again, there is no consensus that, there is consensus that it happens, but there is no consensus on exactly what the mechanism is. But the likely mechanism is that you retrieve alongside with me. And by doing so, you also induce forgetting of the aspects of the past that you have not retrieved. And what this process of socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting does is it contributes to mnemonic convergence. As I tell you how the past happened, past that you were also present at, and I, in my own story, neglect to mention certain aspects, not only I will forget a little bit about those aspects I do not mention, but also you. And as a result, our two memories of that event that we have both witnessed will tend to converge. And so socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting causes mnemonic convergence. And so, and a lot of our autobiographical memories emerge in this way. We reminisce with other people who have also witnessed those events. We often do so with people who at least partially trust us or at least are somewhat intimate with us. We have a conversation where we cross cue. So I remember some aspects of the event, you remember other aspects of the event. And in this way, we construct a shared autobiographical memory of that event, where each of us cues a retrieval of some aspects of the event, and by doing so, induces forgetting of other aspects, and socially can be by means of social contagion, implant memories into the other person. And in these ways, what you have is a socially shared construction of a shared memory that includes information that is distributed across the two people or three people or whatever, and that it becomes a shared narrative that leads to convergence when before there might have been divergence. Right. So you might want, and I'm aware of time, so I'm going to speed up. You might, if this is what memory is and how it works, right? Then one might wonder, why would this be memory, right? So if this is, is imaginative simulation, it includes new material that is based on others' testimony and information included in artifact. It's subject to social influence, such as implantation or social contagion, mechanisms of convergence, like retrieval induced forgetting, right? Now, all of this makes sense as something that facilitates social functioning, but why would we even call this memories, right? Why isn't this just imagining the past in a way that leads to shared confabulation? Right, how is this memory rather than imagination? So I think we can sort of think of this conception of memory that I have elaborated as memory rather than imagination. It is, first of all, it is reminiscing rather than imagining, because at least is experienced as reliving the past rather than merely imagining it. But also, I think this then can be seen as an account of memory because it can distinguish successful memory from variety of memory errors, like inability to remember, seeming to remember, but just imagining, and inaccurate memories. So in other words, we can, within this account, explain memory errors. So first memory error is the inability to remember, which is amnesia. And this is simply would be the case when no simulation and so no narrative of the past is produced. And so clearly the account can explain the difference between remembering and amnesia. It can also explain the difference between seemingly remembering but just imagining and remembering. So confabulation or confabulatory memories can be explained as the product of malfunctioning mental time travel. So the idea here is that confabulation is the malfunction of mental time travel. Michaelian also holds this, but he thinks that the system malfunctions when it's unreliable. But since this is a kind of imagination, it's unclear what reliability in this context would mean. So I think that we should think of mental time travel as malfunctioning when it does not service its function, which is planning. And so you have confabulatory memories when you have simulations which are plausible or implausible, but do not feed into planning. So if you think that mental time travel is for future planning, then confabulation is when you have narratives that are experienced as past, but do not feed into practical deliberation. So this is what a faculty of mental time traveling malfunctioning is like. And so confabulation really is something that happens in psychiatric situations. And then we have inaccurate memories, right? And here, inaccurate memories, these are simulations that are product of mental time travel that feed into planning. So inaccurate memories are memories, right? But they they are unsuccessful memories because the narrative they present about past events does not contribute to or even obstruct understanding them, right? And so you have memories as both successful and unsuccessful as simulations that feed into practical deliberation by presenting a narrative of the past. Successful memories are those that produce an understanding of the past. Unsuccessful memories, inaccurate memories, are those that don't present an understanding of the past. So what does understanding the past mean? And how do autobiographical memories provide an understanding of the past? So the idea here is that autobiographical memories are memories about one's own personal past, and this personal past includes largely past activities. And these activities are temporally extended and temporally unified in the sense that cannot be understood by means of temporally local explanations. So, you know, if you want to understand why 3 days ago I checked something, you need to understand it in the context of my plan to give the talk today. You can't explain why somebody did something at the time by looking at things that happened at the time. You have to explain activities as temporally unified in a way that might have to make reference to plans and activities at a distant time. And the view here is then that our personal past often includes activities that have this shape, that are the execution of plans and projects. And so narrative are the most perspicuous way of representing temporary unified activities, because narratives allow for flashbacks and fast forwards. They include for selection of events that are salient and neglecting things that are not salient, and they explain things in terms of the contribution to an overall goal. So they have got they explain things as part of a plot. And so as long as because a personal life in part consists of temporary unified activities that are structured by plans, autobiographical memories as narratives are the most perspicuous representation of people's past lives. And what makes this representation perspicuous is that they represent them as narratively structured in a way that embodies normative structures of plan that project into the future. Right, so what we have then is a view that there is a distinctive epistemic achievement in autobiographical memories when successful, and that achievement is the achievement of narrative understanding, which doesn't mean that it requires, doesn't mean that it's sufficient to have a true chronicle of past facts. It can tolerate some inaccuracies. What is important is that is a narrative structure that selects relevant events on the basis of current and past plans, right? And what we have understanding is when the narrative template of presented in the narrative understanding of the autobiographical memories is one that enables rather than obstruct current planning, right? So the idea is this. The idea is that episodic memories are narratively structured representations. The reason why we need narratively structured representations is because what they represent are temporally unified activities. What unifies temporally unified activities is a normative structure of goals and plans. And narratives are the best means to represent these goals and plans. What makes narratives accurate, what makes them a form of understanding, is not that they are a list, a true list of what happened in the past, is that they reflect the goals that informed the past in a way that enables a continuation in the future of those goals and plans, or of new goals and plans enabled by the past goals and plans. Right, and so this would also explain why autobiographical memories are linked in the way they are with personal identity. Not that our personal identity is necessarily narratively structured, but that the best way of explaining our sense of our continuing self in our activities, goals, and plans is by means of a narrative. And of course, since so many of our activities, temporary unified activities, are carried out with others, it would make sense that our narratives require narrating the contribution of other peoples. And so it would make sense that our narratives are jointly constructed so as to present these temporally extended activities as the activities carried out jointly by more than one agent. So taking stock then, and I will only say, I will not talk about collective memory because I'm aware that I've run out of time. Taking stock then, autobiographical memory is the product of imagination, is constructive. It consists in narratives rather than mere sequences of proposition. When successful, it supplies an understanding of past temporally unified activities that enable current and future planning. It is deeply shaped by social influences and can be the result of a joint activity of constructing narratives suitable for joint planning. And this is why, in a society deeply riven by injustice, autobiographical memories is deeply, deeply vulnerable to complicity in social injustice. So I have said that we construct the past rather than retrieve it, that we do it in the service of future planning, that we do it jointly, and so that we are deeply shaped by social influences. But these social influences are in turn shaped by power relationships. So I've said that social contagion, the people who can influence memories the most are people who arrogate the role of narrators. And of course, it's people with power who can do that. I've also said that through socially shared retrieval induced forgetting, people who present a version of the story forget the other side of those events, but also induce the forgetting in other people, with the result that we have mnemonic convergence into a constructed representation of the shared past, but one that converges onto the view of the past that is presented by those who have the stage, who are able to narrate the past for everybody else. And furthermore, that we tend to do so by using cultural templates that might reflect oppression. So think about cultural templates about women's timidity and so on and so forth, right? And so what we then what I want to say is that this concept of autobiographical memory can help us explain how autobiographical memories are deeply involved in certain forms of hermeneutical injustice. Hermeneutical injustice, as Fricke understands it, is when one cannot make sense of one's own experiences, or perhaps as, although this is not Fricke's view, a distorted understanding of one's own experiences due to social marginalization. What I want to suggest is that the process of social construction of autobiographical memory is such that not only we might not make sense of our experiences because we lack the concepts, but actually we might no longer be able to remember our own experiences because we have converged into a shared construction of the past by a process of mnemonic convergence, which involves forgetting, that is being guided by the recollection of the past that has been voiced by those who have been able to arrogate the role of narrator. You can see, I hope, how this then transfers to similar issues when it comes to collective memories, i.e. in a society, so only certain people will be able to have the role of narrator, and they'll be able, provided other people don't mistrust them, to provide the collective memory of the past that enables joint agency for that group, but it's actually predicated on the forgetting of the kind of stories about the past that would enable a joint activity that is less structured by oppression. So I'll stop here because in the interest of time. Thank you so much.